So the speaker for our closing address is Margaret George, New York Times bestseller, whose books have ranged from the Tudors to ancient Egypt, to biblical times, to Homeric Greece, and now back to the Tudors, I believe. Margaret writes what I'd call mainstream historical fiction. It's biographical, it treats major historical figures, and it's weighty. You're going to end up knowing more about the subject when you finish it. It's also what I'd call ventriloquist fiction, but it's fiction in the tradition of Robert Graves, Margaret Irwin, Marguerite Yourcenar, a glorious tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret George.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? All right, I guess we got the right tone here. Thank you all for having me. I've had a wonderful day, and I've learned an awful lot, heard a lot of interesting things. The original title for this talk was going to be The Ghosts of Christmases Past, because that's what we do. And about our going back to the past, I mean, that's what this whole meeting has been about. We try in various and sundry ways to get back to the past, and some of the workshops I heard today were talking about how much fact you should be loyal to, and where does fiction come in. We've always wanted to go back to the past. That's what I find very interesting. We seem to be the only species that is actually aware that we have a past as a species. The Romans wanted to visit the ancient ruins in Egypt. They like to go sightseeing and see the pyramids and the Sphinx, just like we do. In fact, Cleopatra took Caesar on a little sightseeing trip down the Nile, and it lasted about 6 weeks, and his soldiers got very restless, and they had to turn around and come back, but it was a high point. Caesar was not going to leave Egypt without seeing those sights. We have done it through archaeology. Surprisingly, it wasn't until fairly recently that people realized the past laid under the ground, that it had been covered up. And so that, like the vanished temple of Diana in Ephesus, the pillars were there under the ground. And we learn about structures from archaeology. We learn about, we try to interpret how these structures were used. Sometimes it's a mystery. We'll see a certain kind of a building, and we can't tell whether really it's a shrine or whether it's a house. And we try to interpret the past that way. And then collecting, people have always wanted to collect ancient artifacts, partly to bring them closer to the past, but the Renaissance popes were the ones that first discovered all these wonderful statues lying around in Rome and started collecting them, and as a result, the Vatican museums are some of the best museums in the world for ancient art, and they saved them from destruction. Some of our most famous statues, like the Apollo Belvedere, was a papal find. Museums, especially lately, have become much more interactive, where we have not only the objects sitting there with a little sign on them, but we usually have some kind of special display. We have audio guides. We have interactive touch screens, all these things to try to bring us closer to the past. And of course, we have reenactors, which were so nice to come to this meeting. That's not that long of a finding either. I mean, we have Civil War reenactors, and then we've got hardcore Civil War reenactors that have to have the exact kind of buttons and can't have a Granny Smith apple in their knapsack because that didn't exist in the Civil War, all the way to the more like the Society for Creative Anachronism people. I recently went to the War of 1812 reenactment because there actually was a battle in Wisconsin when those bad Canadian Brits tried to invade, and then actually we lost the battle. But the reenacting was very nice because they had the fort and everything. Here in England, I know there's the Ermine Street Regulars that do the Roman soldiers. So that's one way we like to pretend. And of course, tonight, some of us are going to dress up in our chosen period costumes and feel that we really are there. Through art, now you could say that historical paintings actually got started with the religious paintings, because Historical paintings were to show people something that we didn't see because we were not there. We like to imagine it, and so that's where all the crucifixion scenes, I mean, none of these painters actually were at the crucifixion or at the Last Supper or any of these scenes, but we wanted to see them. And then, by the time we got into the 19th century, Victorians were very fond of these historical paintings, and a lot of our secular paintings of really important events, and for example, the death of Horatio Nelson on the deck of his boat, and Cleopatra and the Snake was very popular, biblical paintings. And so growing out of that, of course, came the movies, and almost as soon as movies became technically pretty sophisticated, almost the first thing they wanted to do was to reenact historical things. They wanted to film these moments that they had always read about, Pharaoh and Moses and the bulrushes. And there were 6 Cleopatra movies made before 1920. We don't have any of them today. We have some stills from the Theda Bara, but we've lost the others. So I think the movies wanted to make it visual, and I think a lot of us still, even though we laugh about the Tudors, I think you enjoy seeing a visual representation of history. And I know I've always found historical movies to really be helpful, even if a lot of it's wrong, just because the people are moving around and talking, and you can see them wearing their costumes. Very interestingly, The Midnight in Paris kind of played on that Woody Allen movie, because the theme of it was that someone living now wanted to go back in Paris to the Paris of the 1920s, because that was when Paris was it. The writers were there, all these iconic names. But then someone living in the 1920s, an actual character, wanted to go back to the 1890s, because that's when all the great painters were there. They wanted to be with Toulouse-Lautrec and Monet, and the 1920s. She just didn't want to be there. So I think we have this longing to go back. And then, of course, the main thing, and the thing that concerns us, is writing about the past. So we've always had historical novels, as someone pointed out in one of the talks that I heard today. And of course, we have Shakespeare. Some of the Richard III people are not happy, and also the Henry IV people, also someone said he has a lot to answer for. But certainly, he preserved history and made it alive in a lot of ways for English legacy. And then historical novels first came in the Victorian times, and some people think Sir Walter Scott was the first, really big league practitioner of this, made the Middle Ages wildly popular. And then going on into coming closer to our times, we had Jean Plady, we had Nora Lofts, we had Thomas B. Costain. So we've always done this, and it's just that we really try so hard to get back to the past. So here's the definition I found of historical novels. A novel that has as its setting a usually significant period of history, and that attempts to convey the spirit, manners, and social conditions of a past age with realistic detail and fidelity to historical fact. And so we've been talking today about how realistic should the details be, and how close should you be to the historical fact. But we really try to do this because we want to bring ourselves back into that time, but also to take other people back to that time. Now, when I started out, I really did believe that if I just read enough and went to enough places and absorbed all this information, because I thought, actually, I was very trusting that what's written down is all true, and that these facts, they've been verified, and those people who would say things like, well, how do you know that? Well, they just didn't get it. So you go through this phase where you think you imagine that you know so much that if you went back to that time, you could actually pass. You get down there, and there you are with Leonardo da Vinci, and he's not going to know that you're not from that time because you know so much. You think that you could, especially with Henry VIII, I mean, I could obviously go to his court and I could just blend right in. Never mind about the language. We leave that little part out about language. And then I looked for boo-boos in movies and books, and you see a movie about the Romans and they're riding with stirrups, and you think, well, I just don't know. People just didn't do their research. But as you go on, as I went on, I found out, I got comeuppances because we all make mistakes. I mean, first of all, leaving out the fact that perhaps the facts aren't all correct that we have to draw from, we make mistakes. And for one of the first ones, it was that I had a scene where Henry VIII, he woke up in the middle of the night and he had to get dressed, and he was fishing around for his shoes, and he put the shoes on the wrong foot. Well, I got a reader writing in and saying, left and right feet were not differentiated until 1818. He would not have had left and right shoes to put on the wrong foot. Now, in my earlier, more defensive stage, I would have thought, well, yes, but we all know that if you wear shoes for a while, they take the shape of your foot, so probably he did have left and right shoes. But the truth is, I just didn't know that. This is a letter from a reader that was reading Elizabeth I. He says, an email. I was interested on page 577 when Essex as a lord is being tried before his literal peers. You describe that the lords place their left hands, he has left in big capitals, on their right sides. That to me seems strange, as the heart, of course, is on the left side. I remembered the description of the trial in the House of Lords of the Earl of Cardigan for dueling as described by Cecil Woodham Smith. I'm sure you know this author is actually a woman. In her classic, The Reason Why. I pulled that book off my shelves, and in his trial before the Lords, the author states that the peers placed their right hands upon their breasts, page 86 in my old paperback edition. I thought this very minor point might interest you, as you are so careful in all respects in historical detail, which I find so incredible and satisfying, and would be interested in seeing what sources you consulted about this. Well, the truth is I probably just put my hand on the wrong side, because it's been a long time since in America we used to do the Pledge of Allegiance, and we would stand up and do this, but we don't do that anymore, and I probably just didn't think about it. And anyway, I got it wrong. I'll go back and read my notes for that thing, because what I do is I'll write a scene, and whenever there's a fact that I've gotten from a book, I will write it by hand out in the margin so I know where that source was. So otherwise, you go on and you never find it again. So I'll see if there's a little note out by the side about putting his hand, which hand he used. But honestly, it's just that I made a mistake. Maybe I made a mistake. Anyway, the point of this and where I'm leading to is that the past is really more murky and mysterious than we think. It's much less graspable. And even our own past is very difficult to recover. I mean, we think about these historical characters, but think about your own past. And, the people, it's very popular now for the, regression and hypnosis and everything, but I think of our life is like a string of beads with the string is our consciousness. And the beads, for most of us, are like really kind of self-contained little parts of our lives. And most of us can't remember much before we were 3 or 4. But we have the first bead would be when we're home with our mother, although I guess now we go to preschool. And then there's the grade school bead, and there's the middle school bead, and there's the high school, and then there's the college, and then there's this and this. But they don't communicate with each other a lot. You think of them being very cut off from each other, especially people go away to school. And in my own life, it's especially that way because my father was in the Foreign Service. He was assigned to certain overseas posts. We know the exact date that we went there, the exact date we left, so there would be little 2-year boxes. And so I would know exactly, these different parts. And one of the most part that I really wanted to get back was, believe it or not, 7th and 8th grades. Now, I know probably most of you all have seen or read A Christmas Carol. And there's a scene where the first ghost, the ghost of Christmas Past, that's where the title was going to come from, comes to Scrooge and says, I'm the ghost of Christmas Past. And he says, long past? And she says, no, your past. And she takes him to, his first scene is a schoolyard. It's at Christmas time. And poor Scrooge is like 8 years old. He's sitting all alone in this school where everyone else has gone home because they have a nice home to go to, but Scrooge's father doesn't want him home. And poor lonely little Ebenezer is there. And this sort of explains why he grew up to be so mean. But the grown-up Scrooge is looking down on this. He's seeing the scene. And so I actually lived in Berlin, Germany, when I was in 7th and 8th grades. And I went to an American school that was mainly a military school. I mean, mainly were the children of officers there. And I don't know if anybody's ever happy in 7th and 8th grades. I mean, I think it's a painful but a very vital time in our lives. And that's because we're so sensitive to every single thing about ourselves. I mean, we don't really see anything much around beyond who's sitting in front of us and who's behind us at school and who's at what lunch table. And that's when I really started writing seriously, because that was my escape. You know, you could come home and write all these things and live in some other world. I was going to Berlin this summer, actually, for the first time in many, many, many years. And I got the idea that I was going to do like Scrooge did in this scene. I was going to find the house that I lived in then and see what was my life really like then. Because I honestly didn't, I mean, I remember I could ride my bicycle to movies, I remembered certain things, but they were little pieces. And because I was so self-absorbed. And so I knew the address of the house. I knew that the address was 9 Wachtelstrasse. And I knew that there was a beautiful park right next to it called Vogelsang, and it had nothing but birch trees in the middle and cobblestones. And I loved that little house that we had lived in. It sort of was a Hansel and Gretel type of house. It had one of those roofs like this and had a red roof with a little kind of a window peeking out, and it had shutters, and it was kind of walled, and it had secret passages in it, all the kind of things that would appeal to a kid. And a beautiful black and white marble foyer. So I knew I would have to find it on a map, and so I went to Google Google Maps. I put in the address, and it's really funny that Philippa said that this morning about Google Earth, because not only did I get the map of where it was with a little arrow, but there was a picture, not of Wachtelstrasse, but around the corner, Vogelsang. And I could kind of take my mouse and trying to urge it to go and turn the corner, and it didn't want to. It would keep jumping some other place, and finally I got it to turn that corner. And that's kind of the way I feel when I'm writing a novel. It's like you almost mentally are there in Henry's court, and you almost feel like you are going down the corridor, and now you're going to turn, and what are you going to see in there? It was very much like the process of writing the book, but it was trying to recover my own life. So, I inched along, I finally got it onto the Wachtelstrasse, and they didn't have number 9. They had number 17. But because Google Earth, it's not live. I mean, it's just stills that have been kind of put together. So again, in my mind, this place all still existed this way. I almost thought if I went there, my parents would still be there, young and alive, and my little sister would still be 4, and somehow I'd almost see myself there. So anyway, when I got there, and I was walking down the street and looking for it. I finally got there, and it was like a cross between a mausoleum and a dental office. Someone had they had stripped off the red roof. They put some metal thing on it. They whitewashed the whole thing. They took off all the shutters. They had a great big watch fence around it with an eye looking at you. And, I looked at it, and I guess that's the first time I realized viscerally, you really cannot go back to the past. I mean, there's just an impenetrable veil between you. And you can try your best, you can use all of the aids possible, but that was gone. I mean, the thing about Scrooge looking at himself as a little boy was again, it was a fiction. And so, and if we really could go back, this is what I wonder, if we really could drop ourselves back, parachute in, do the thing about trying to pass, it would probably be about as different as that house looked to me. It wouldn't be the way we think it's going to be. That wouldn't stop us from wanting to find out, because we do want to find out. But it was really a shock. So I guess the lesson is that, we can only go back in our imaginations. And we are the people that take other people back there. I mean, we're as good as it gets. We are the time machine for other people. And they rely on us to take them back and to use our imaginations to take them back. And so it's an imperfect system. We can keep the past alive the best that we can, but we have to realize how much we're still lacking. But it's still worth doing. Now, one of the things I saw in Berlin on the same trip was the Pergamon Museum had what they called a diorama, and I didn't realize what this would mean, but an artist had painted a huge, bigger than this room around, diorama of Pergamon at its height, when it was, all the philosophers and everybody was there in the medical school and the great library. And it must have had 1,000 people in it. So it was all housed in this gigantic drum. And you had to walk up these spiral stairs to get there. When you got there, you were up at the top and looking down. And all around you was this ancient city. And they had sound effects, they had sunset and sunrise and different lighting and fires burning when it got dark, and torches and so on. And you thought if you just looked hard enough, you'd see these people move. You really did. And that probably is about as close as I'll ever get to being able to really go back to the past. And again, it's an artist's conception. And I guess I think that we should never think that our imagination isn't important. It's very powerful. We should trust it. We should give ourselves to it. And we should never, ever think we don't have a noble calling, because we do. And, there's some studies about our quest as a species for immortality. And apparently there are 4 ways that we, through the ages, have tried to become immortal. One is the physical, which is, you find the fountain of youth, you drink a special potion, calorie deprivation diet, which they've recently said doesn't work, so we can all go back to eating now. Then there's the belief in the afterlife, that just the body is gone, but you've gone on to some other sphere. Then there's the reincarnation, which is that you die, but your spirit doesn't go up, it goes into somebody else. And then last of all is you live on in immortality because you are remembered and kept alive by your fellow people, which is really what we're doing with all these people we write about. We're keeping them alive. We're giving them the 4th kind of immortality. And that's something that really is a noble calling. And I think we all in this room can be proud that that's what we do and never apologize for it. I know sometimes people say, I'm a historical novelist. But really, we should be proud of what we do. So I will open the floor for some questions. I know people will be getting ready to go off to our reenactment tonight, and not to mention the late night sex scene readings. So we want to give people time for that. So I'm happy to take questions from anybody. No questions? Oh, a question.
Do you think you'll ever go back to the biblical period for writing?
Possibly, yeah. I think I'm kind of tutored out at this point. I mean, most of the so I'll be going back to the ancient world and possibly the biblical world.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Nobody else? Nobody? All right. Wait, okay.
It's not really a question, it's a comment. I love what you said about us being the time machine for other people to take us back. I think that's just a wonderful image. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. No, I do feel that we are. There were a couple of other people that had their hands up. There was, you know, that.
I'm wondering if you have a favorite period in history.
Well, I mean, I do very much like the Tudor period, and I like medieval times, although we were talking about that in one of the panels today, about how that it's harder to get inside the minds of medieval people. We don't know that much about their psychology, and I do really like ancient. I think you start out as a little kid liking ancient because of the pyramids and those neat outfits they wore in their chariots, and you kind of never outgrow it. Yes.
The first book of yours that I read was the Autobiography of Henry VIII, and I loved it. I gave it to everybody for Christmas that year. The Autobiography of Henry VIII was such a great book. How did you, I'm sure you've told this a million times, but I don't know, how did you come to the idea of taking Henry's fool, Will Sommers, and writing from that point of view?
Well, I did have a first draft that didn't have Will Sommers in it. And I felt something was kind of missing. I couldn't figure out quite what, and I will confess, especially since he's now departed, Gore Vidal. Julian, that book by Gore Vidal about the Emperor Julian, it had people commenting on, it actually had two other people commenting on the Emperor Julian's manuscript. And that, to me, brought that story alive, because it allowed people, and they said very catty things about Julian. Like they'd say, "Oh, Julian, he's talking that way again," you know. Oh, and it gave me the idea, and I thought it would work well with Henry. But then I had to find somebody historically that outlived Henry, but hopefully would have known him for a long time and would be fitted for the part. Now, Will Sommers didn't come on with Henry until Henry was already, I think, the Field of Cloth of Gold. So unfortunately, I didn't have that part to fill in, but he was with him all the way through, and he was really historical, and conveniently that his personality was such that he would have been able to talk back to Henry. And he just was perfect. If only he had come into the service a little earlier. Anybody else? Well, I saw some other hands earlier, but if there's no other oh, there's somebody. Oh.
Jump up the front. Yeah, this is done deliberately, isn't it? Jenny, jump there.
Huh?
Go back.
There was a man right there.
Well, you say you can't trust the past, you know, that we can never really imagine it, even going back in our own lives. But of course, we're making the past as we go along, because I'm not a novelist, I'm only a historian in a very small way, but I have written history. Because when I was a civil servant, one of the tasks of our section was to decide which records were to go to the archives. And the records we decided to go to the archives, we weeded them, that's the technical term, and we left out anything that would reflect discredit upon the department. And we did things like we didn't actually alter anything, except any stylistic errors or mistypes and things like that. We altered them, you know, so they didn't think we were too illiterate, you know, that sort of thing. So we actually decided what was history. And having decided what was history, we sent it to the archives. And in hundreds of years' time, people will come and they'll know what the real history of the thing was, you know, because that's what we decided was history.
I think that illustrates just what I was saying. But I once upon a time believed that because these things were in the archives, that was the whole story, but the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that I could really master this by learning these things. And I said, it's a lack of sophistication that made me think that, and now I'm much more aware of the subtleties and the shades and all the things that are missing, and that we just kind of do the best we can. But we'll never know. We'll never really know the whole truth, and maybe not even about things that happen to us. Yes.
So that's how you stay slim. I was just wondering, I mean, that perfectly illustrates a lot of the debates that have been going on today about historical truth and accuracy and authenticity. The trouble is, if we don't know what the truth ever is, how is it possible to lie about it?
Well, I guess maybe you think you're lying about it and consciously making it up, and it may turn out that it was true, because you really don't know. Maybe that happens sometimes. Say.
Thank you. I have another example from my life. My mother was, my family was in Virginia during the Civil Rights Movement, and my mother was a part of that movement, just a foot soldier in that movement. And she was very relieved when we moved, partly because they weren't really letting, University of Virginia was not coeducational, and she wanted to go back to school. And I mentioned something like this in a comment on the internet, and some bright young person immediately went to the University of Virginia website and said, "No, you're wrong. It was coeducational," and corrected my life. In fact, it was theoretically coeducational. So the University of Virginia had written their website to suggest that it wasn't really segregated the way it was. They had a separate school for women, which was rather different. But it was interesting and galling at the same time to have someone correcting my experience in life.
I imagine so. Well, yeah, and that's an example of how we believe what we see on the internet or what's written down, or if it's the official website of the University of Virginia, well, they must be right and you must be wrong.
Hello, Mark
Hello.
Evans. This follows on from the previous lady's comment, actually. What I'm talking about really is history within living memory. In the 80s and early 90s, I was actually a defence analyst involved with all sorts of strange studies I won't bore you with, but it's part of the Cold War. And it fascinates me now that actually what we were doing then is now written up as history. And the question really is it better to write historical fiction about things that are not within living memory, or should we bite the bullet and go ahead and write about things which can still be remembered?
Oh, well, I gather you want to write something of that time. I think you'd have more people contradicting you, but that's, or arguing with you. But you're always going to get them. I mean, look at the person writing about the hand is over the heart. So I don't think there's any way to avoid having people question you. And so if you want to write about a certain era, which is slipping very, very much into the past. I mean, when I was in Berlin this time, I couldn't believe that Checkpoint Charlie was now a swinging tourist place where people pose next to fake soldiers, and, dressed up like, it's just, and already, people don't remember what it was like 20 years ago there because the wall came down in '89. So, I mean, that's within living memory. So, yeah. You have another one. Oh, there's one there. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. A really interesting last point that I just wanted to ask, would you think there's a specific value, particularly in writing about our current times, because at least somebody's saying this is how it was, I lived through it, because people just, as you said, they don't remember it anymore. People will just say, no, it couldn't possibly have been like that. These things didn't happen. And history just, real knowledge of terrible things that happened in the last century just disappear. And people will shrug their shoulders saying there couldn't be. And whole lots of things just get forgotten, because if we don't remember them, in a way, they didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, I think we get a lot of documentation now that we didn't earlier. So okay, I think they said this is the last question. So I think it's time to go and
I'd just like to say,
and rush off to get our reenactment outfits on. Thank you.